This episode is brought to you by Education Perfect, a complete teaching and learning toolkit built to support Canadian classrooms. Education Perfect empowers educators to track progress, personalize learning, and support purposeful practice. It's easy to use, flexible, and designed to help Canadian teachers amplify their impact in the classroom. See for yourself and book a free demo today at educationperfect.com.
I think one quality that comes to mind is whenever I walk the halls, and I think sometimes, teachers or even principals are embarrassed when there's a loud classroom happening, and they want to close the door. And again, I always kind of discourage that. I'm like, to me, a loud classroom means that there are people talking. And that means kids. If it's loud, that means the kids are talking. The kids are asking questions. The kids are kind of sharing knowledge with each other. I like a classroom that has a lot of learning noises, which means kids are talking, teachers are circulating, teachers are asking more questions than telling answers.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Today's guest is Camillo Cipriano, the Director of Education of the Niagara Catholic District School Board. He's worked across the education system for nearly 3 decades, but what struck me most in our conversation was his willingness to reflect, his deep belief in the power of relationships, and his humility. Camillo didn't begin his career in education. He started in business, wearing a suit to work and chasing a sense of meaning that didn't seem to ever arrive. And as it turns out, it wasn't until he found himself coaching his much younger brother's baseball team and being told that he has a real gift with kids that the spark for teaching really lit up. Since then, he's gone from being a classroom teacher to a principal and to senior leadership, always seemingly carrying with him a sense of care, calm, and clarity that you can hear throughout this conversation. In our discussion, we explore the formative experiences that shaped Camillo, from growing up as a child of Italian immigrants in Milton, Ontario, to his early years in education, and the students who surprised him, changed him, and stayed with him. Camillo talks about the importance of unstructured play and imagination, and perhaps what we've lost in an age of overprotection and overprogramming. He also highlights the need for balance between technology, traditional learning, between risk and safety, between structure and curiosity. He goes on to advocate for learning environments where kids can rely on their creativity and resilience, where educators are empowered to evolve alongside the systems they serve. We also discuss the shifting role of teachers, the need to build trust within public education, and the promise and peril of artificial intelligence in schools, a topic Camillo approaches with both excitement and caution. Today's conversation is about leadership, learning, and the quiet power of thoughtful, grounded education. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Camillo Cipriano. Camillo Cipriano, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
Good morning, Jason, and thank you for the invitation. I am in Welland, Ontario. That is the location of our board office. It is a hot July day, like most of Ontario today. So it's nice to be in a cool environment in Welland.
Awesome, and quite the background for those watching on the YouTube channel. Can you just describe your current role and what your day-to-day life is like?
Sure. So my title is the Director of Education and Secretary Treasurer to the Board for the Niagara Catholic District School Board. The Niagara Catholic District School Board has approximately 24,000 students in 48 elementary schools, and that's K-8 in our board. And we have 8 high schools, and we also have 2 continuing education centers. So we have a large geography, not as large as some of the northern boards in Ontario, but large enough. We span from basically the border of Stony Creek, Hamilton, Ontario. It starts at Grimsby is our school district. And we go to both lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and we hit the border with the U.S., so all the way up to Fort Erie in that area.
Yeah, well, really one of the most gorgeous parts of Southern Ontario. Um, so, Camilo, we always start with introducing the audience to the human behind the role. So, I'd love to start if you could take me back to where and when you grew up.
Sure. I was born in Toronto. My parents were immigrants from Italy, but we moved when I was really young. When I was about 7, we moved to Milton, Ontario. And Milton is very different today than it was in the late 70s when we moved there. It was
Mm.
a lot of farmland, not a lot
Still,
of
still
diversity.
is a lot of, still is a lot
There
of
is a
farm.
lot of farmland, although they've developed most of it now. I was
Yeah.
there just, I think, a week and a half ago, and I saw the sign that said 133,000 residents now in Milton.
Wow.
And I think I asked my parents a few months ago when we moved there. I think it was 22,000
Mm.
residents in late 70s, and it's at 133 now. 133,000. Not a lot of diversity at the time. I was somewhat unique because I had a bit of olive skin coming into
Mhm.
the schools there. But I loved growing up in Milton. Again, I had great friends, great schools, great neighbors. So it shaped me.
So, how did you and your friends play as you're growing up?
I'm going to sound like an old man now, but we played with a lot using our imaginations.
Mm.
Being the children of immigrants, we didn't have a lot of expensive toys back then. I remember into my late elementary years, early high school years, some video games were being created by Atari and television, but we couldn't afford those, so we used our imagination. We made up games. We explored a lot of the creeks and rivers in Milton. Again, probably something that parents today would never let their child do because it was somewhat risky, physical risk to us, but we loved it. We especially the summer months, July and August, it was simply just a time to, again, I'm going to sound so cliche, but leave when in the morning when the sun is coming up and come back when the sun's going down because we just kind of really wanted to be outside. And I think it is something that today's youth, for a lot of reasons, I think they suffer from not having the ability to use their imagination in play. Because I think when you use your imagination and making up games, making up kind of ways to entertain yourself, I think it starts building your brain for your future in how to maybe create something. And I'm not creative at all, but I do think it helped shape my thinking around just kind of problem solving.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a commonality of a lot of the superintendents, directors, and a lot of the other folks that I've had on the podcast is that we grew up in this era that was, relatively low tech, right? Like we adapted pretty quickly because, like you said, the video games and TV and phones and all that started coming in when we were, in our teens and 20s. But I think there's something here that we've lost as a society, and that's why I always ask and just remind people of how we grew up, and there was a lot of good in that. So with that, what do you wish we can instill in kids today that you had? Like, obviously there's this free play element. Like, do you talk to your parents generally about giving kids more freedom outdoors and allowing them to explore?
Yeah, it's that kind of double-edged sword because I get it as parents today, our parents today, and I what I've realized in my education career, I've in preparing for this today, you kind of start looking back and reflecting, and I think about I started in education a little later than most. I started when I was in my mid to late 20s. It was a second career for me,
Mm.
and when I first started teaching, the parents of the students were older than I was. And then, after about, a decade, the parents of my students were my age.
Mm.
And then I became a principal, and the parents of the kindergarten kids were a little bit younger than me, just a little bit. And then I became a superintendent, and the parents became a little younger than me. And now, as a director, when I go visit, school events, graduations, celebrations, and you see parents, and you're thinking, wow, these are young kids are parents today. And these young parents grew up in this, in an era with technology. Our parents today grew up with the internet. They grew up with social media. And so they have a different mindset. They have a different understanding. So for us that are leaders in an era where a lot of our parents, grew up in this, this technological world that they did, we have to try and kind of find that bridge where they can have an understanding that, what we're trying to create or recreate sometimes is an environment where kids can, rely more again on their own rather than trying to always try and protect our children. We talk a lot about, trying to let kids fail. And again, as a parent myself, as a father myself of two girls in their 20s now, it's hard. It's hard to see your child fail and not want to rescue them. And so again, I this is not judgment on my part because I've lived it myself, but it may be one of the most important things we do as parents and as educators to let kids fail and let kids make mistakes and let kids scrape their knees and let kids, go out on their own sometimes, because that's when true and authentic learning happens. And so the question you asked about how, what would I hope? My hope is that we can get to a place, and it's harder every day gets harder as we get more reliant on technology to get to a place where we can let our kids fail, basically. And failure means learning.
I read somewhere that we overprotect our kids out in public and underprotect them online. Is that something you generally have seen?
That's an interesting statement and probably something that I would fully agree with. I do think parents today are becoming more aware of online protection because there's so many kind of really tragic and scary stories out there about what's happening on the internet. But that's absolutely true. You're right. Again, you walk by a park today, especially in July, and you see kids playing at parks, swings, but you see the parents right there as well, sitting down, usually on their own phones, but they're in the vicinity. The idea of asking a parent today to let their child, let's say under 10, to go to the park alone, I think parents would call the police or children's services on a parent if they thought they let their child go to the park alone today. Whereas in my era, in the 80s, in the 90s even, and most definitely in the 70s and the 60s, that was a common practice. Parents had a natural trust of the world around them that they let kids to explore. And of course, were there tragedies then? Yes. And again, if you watch any Netflix special nowadays, you'll read about or watch something that happened in the 70s and 80s that was tragic. And again, not to diminish that, but I think in our response over time, we have, I think, overcorrected, and it's resulted in our unwillingness to let our kids, explore on their own.
Yeah. Well, thankfully mine are over 10, but I used to let them do it, and the looks I would get from our friends when I would tell them, I'd let my 8-year-old go to the park. I mean, he's with his 9-year-old sisters. Well, 9-year-old's not better. But no one can call child services on me now because they're
Good.
that biking age. You know what I miss the most, Camilo? I always thought as a kid, when I see kids playing street hockey, I'm not going to bother them. Like I imagine it was the same for you. The older generation hated us playing hockey in the streets. And I said, when I see that, I'm gonna go play with them. It's just non-existent anymore. Like, talk about a cultural change from a Canadian perspective. Like, you couldn't walk 3 streets and not find a hockey game. Now it's like you don't see it at all. Never mind.
No. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Like street hockey, you never see street hockey. I would suggest there's a few reasons for that. One of them is also organized sports have become too organized.
Right.
Like if you do like hockey, you're probably playing hockey,
all the time.
360 out of 365 days a year. Even in the summer, there's dry lane training. There's summer hockey. Again, we have over organized and over scheduled our kids. I laugh at the idea. And again, I want to be clear with the audience. This is not me saying I didn't do this myself. As a parent, my kids were young. We arranged play dates. Think of that for a moment. The idea of a play date where kids aren't calling on each other naturally and organically. We have to schedule the play dates for our children. And so the idea of street hockey is that I think you're right. Parents, kids today are sitting on their technologies and playing games there. Parents don't want their children outside, out of their sight. And then finally, those kids that do love hockey, that when there's a lot of them still, they're probably tired of hockey because they're playing so much of it and practicing so much. They're like, I don't want to play it on my own now in front of my street. So I think those all contribute to that.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this because I think there is something to be said too about your initial point about resilience, right? A lot of this unstructured play, exploration, a little bit of risky play builds resilience, which I think is maybe the skill or competency, dare I say, that they need the most going forward, given the uncertainties of what our technological future is going to bring to the job market. So maybe we'll swing back there, but let's take a bit of a detour through your younger years. What do you remember really like loving to learn? What was one of the first things that you remember just being fixated with and wanting to learn more about?
Two things come to mind. Number one, I was always, I had a natural kind of inclination and drawn towards math. I love numbers. To this day, I love numbers. I love, numbers when it comes to sports and analytics and statistics. I like numbers when it comes to just, kind of looking at trends and data. I think it's something important in my role to kind of, to make sure that when we're making decisions, we're looking at, hard numbers. And again, not that numbers are the be all and end all, but it's important to understand when we make decisions, what's the impact? And usually that's through measurement of some kind. And so, and typically when you measure something, you're talking about numbers. So I've always been someone that loved math. I excelled in it in school. I took it all the way through university. And it was one of the subject areas that I actually enjoyed. To this day, I love doing things like Sudokus and any kind of puzzles that involve some kind of, numbered kind of numeric complications. Another area that I was always kind of drawn to, and this was more just my own personal, was maps. I loved maps. Again, another area that we can talk about how technology has changed. I used to sit and look at atlases and maps all the time. Local maps, roads. I used to love looking at just the geography of Europe and Africa and try and memorize some of the countries. And I don't know why, I always just kind of had an enjoyment of looking at maps. And to this day, I still like looking at maps. And although it's a kind of an antiquated kind of medium now.
Practice,
There's you can't find atlases and you can't find, road maps anymore. I used to love doing road trips. I still love doing road trips. I used to love taking out the map and highlighting our routes and trying to figure out which roads and which was the most efficient way. So those are the two areas that I've always, and it's funny because you would think then I would be drawn to geography, but I like geography, but it's nothing that I really kind of pursued in any way. I just loved maps though. I loved looking at maps.
Yeah, you kind of stirred something in me too. I used to love maps too. We just did a road trip and I was explaining to the kids what triptychs were. I don't know if you remember the good old triptych, and I'm like, the triptych was like an innovation. We used to use these big maps and you just have this really high level detail of the roads, and then triptychs gave you all this really cool information.
Correct.
They were kind of perplexed by the whole thing. So what did you study in university?
I went into I used my kind of my interest and my love of math and I went into business commerce. So I have an honors BCom from McMaster. So I thought I'd be working in business and finance, some kind of some role that required some kind of mathematical analytics of marketing strategies or financial strategies, and that was my first kind of job. I worked in the fund industry, in the mutual fund industry, in the stock industry. And for the first maybe 3-4 years of kind of my, my me being grown up in my 20s, that's kind of what I was doing, and I didn't really have a lot of kind of, there's no sense of accomplishment in that. And again, it was early days. It's not that I was, leading a team or an organization. It was, you're kind of entry level, and it just felt there was not a lot of kind of heart involved in it.
Well, something else that keeps coming up in these podcasts, especially with senior leaders, is an early detour, if I can call it that, that you wouldn't expect someone to then become a superintendent. A lot of the folks that I've been interviewing have done something else before education. So what was the calling? Like, how did you find your way into the education system?
I mean, it's going to sound somewhat kind of obvious and maybe kind of cliche, but it was kids. I was in my 20s. My parents had I don't want to call it a mistake child. It was one of those kind of like, we were, I think I was in grade 8 when they broke the news to us that they were pregnant. So my younger brother is 12 years younger than me, 13 years younger than me. And so I became kind of his, he played a lot of sports. So I was always helping coach those teams. So in my 20s, he would have been 11, 12, 13. And I loved, I remember coming home from work and looking forward to going and help his teams practice, play the games, coach, a lot of baseball back then. And I remember a couple of the parents saying, you're really good with the kids. You're really good with those kind of that adolescent group. Again, I was in my 20s, so I connected maybe better to them than the parents did. And it was kind of like a bit of a light bulb went on. And then someone said, you ever thought about going into teaching? I'm like, not really, because I was always kind of focused on business and finance and kind of going in that direction. And that, that really kind of was the spark that I thought. I was recently engaged at the time, and I started thinking, maybe this might be a better career choice to raise a family rather than like long nights and a lot of time away from home in the finance world. And so that was kind of the seed that germinated into me eventually going to teachers college, and leaving the corporate world for a classroom.
And was there any moments of like, oh my God, what have I done? Or was it just like, this is where I need to be. This is where I ought to be.
There's those, oh my God, what have I done moments happen probably about once a week since
It's still happening.
Yeah, they happen all the time. I remember my very first class was a grade 3-4 class in Aurora, Ontario at Holy Spirit Elementary School. It was a brand new school. I think it had opened for 1 year only before I got there. And I'd gotten the job on Labor Day weekend. I was working for the mutual funds company, and I was just wearing suits. Back today, I think in the corporate world, people are much more casually dressed, business casual. Back then, we wore suits, full suits, ties. And I remember I got the job, I think, on Friday of Labor Day weekend. I went into this classroom, these poor, 7 and 8 year olds. I walk in a full suit. And they probably thought, who is this accountant that's come to take attendance? And so that was kind of my first. I realized very quickly, when I got, I think, paint on my suit that first week that I needed to get a new wardrobe.
This is going to be too expensive to teach if I'm wearing suits like this.
Which is ironic awesome. Now I wear suits again. So, fast forward 27 years later, and I'm back somewhat in a corporate position, dealing with numbers and finance and marketing and all that. So.
What's really interesting, a lot of the things, or I should say one of the things that most superintendents or directors, depending on geography, have mentioned to me they wish they had more of was some of that corporate training, because now you're running a big organization. There's a lot of metrics. There's a lot of people management. So it's, you may be the first to have done it the other way, to get that experience first and then utilize it in your role. So that's fantastic. So you've also worked in several different districts, right? What, in your experience, have been the most inspirational stories that you've come across? Can you share one or two with us?
Yeah. I mean, I started my teaching career in York Catholic, as I'd mentioned, for a couple of years. But I was living in the Halton region. I lived in Burlington at the time. And then I finally got a teaching position in Halton, and so I worked in Halton for probably over 2 decades, and then I've been.
And you started York Catholic though.
I did start at York Catholic. Yeah, that was my. Yeah.
Let's see if you taught me at some point. What schools? What schools were you at?
Only Holy Spirit. If you went to Holy Spirit in Aurora, then that would be me.
No, I was south of that. Okay.
Yeah. But it were probably the right age that I could have been your teacher. So
it would have been early in your career. I don't think we're that far apart. You got.
I started in 1997, so I'm not sure what grade you would have been in 1997.
Yeah, no, I would have been into high school. So
okay, so I would have just missed you.
Yeah.
So the question about inspirational stories.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny how sometimes with social media, one of the benefits of social media is that you can reconnect with people. And so without getting into any specifics, some of the most inspirational stories that I kind of can connect with now is former students of mine who reach out to me either through Facebook or LinkedIn or even just now through email, because I've got a bit of a prominent position in the Niagara Catholic Board. And just it's amazing to hear their evolution. And some of them, again, some of the most inspirational ones are the ones that even me, I'm ashamed to say that I probably didn't have the highest of hopes for these students when they were, my students in my classroom or my students as a principal. And to hear now how successful they are. And when I say successful, I don't mean financially only. That's some of it sometimes, but successful in adulthood, in that they have, that they've found a calling for themselves, either post-secondary, in work, they have a family, they have their own children. And again, that to me, I've always said it demonstrates two things to me: that we as teachers, sometimes as educators, educators by our very nature, we like to be planners. We like to kind of, we have lesson plans, we have day plans, we have week plans, we have monthly plans, we have year plans. And so you're always looking at, we have the tendency to not live in the moment, to not recognize, what's right in front of us. And we're always looking what's next and what should, especially in senior leadership. I always say we're always planning the next season. Right now in July, we're planning for September, October. In June, when we should have been celebrating, which we were celebrating graduations, your mind is on September. You're staffing for September, you're hiring, you're interviewing. Come September, you're planning for Christmas and December. Come December, you're planning for, EQAO in May and June. And then again, you're never in the moment. And so even as teachers, sometimes we get it, you kind of fall into that same kind of structure of always thinking ahead. And you tend to project what's in front of you, the kids in front of you, and what you think they might, end up as or accomplish. And so the most inspiring to me are some of those kids who I maybe didn't think they had, let's say, in their future, success that they ended up having. And just, again, without talking about specifics, it's just something you realize that even though we're planting seeds in education of, we talk about, there's a cliched line that, we plant the seeds of the trees and the plants that we won't be there to experience the harvest, let's say. Even though, we might not think what we're saying is taking root, I can tell you that almost inevitably every student that's reached out to me, former student, through social media or other avenues, will often quote words or phrases or talk about an experience that they had in my classroom or with me as a principal that for me was a kind of a bit of a throwaway comment. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that made an impact on them, not realizing that. So it's both rewarding, but also terrifying to kind of come to terms that your words matter. And, these children, because they are children, whether they're in elementary school or even high school, like I love walking through high schools today and seeing 16 and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds, they're still children. I mean, when you think about it, they're just bigger children.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a great reminder for us all that our words have real impact, and, how we treat people has an impact. And again, what's cliche is that they often talk about how they, how I made them feel in that moment, even in a moment where, one that comes to mind is a student that I probably suspended as a principal a half dozen times. And he reached out to me at some point to talk about how even in suspension, he never felt like I was, I thought
Personally
less of him.
attacking him. Yeah.
Like it was always about, he felt like I was caring for him and cared about him. And that the suspension, it felt like to him that it hurt me to suspend him, which again, I think it did. Again, it's never easy to give a consequence to a child. And getting back to the idea of rescuing our children as parents, it's harder for parents. I used to always have this conversation with parents when I was a principal. I don't blame you for having a hard time, let's say, get removing a privilege from your child because you love them. And while I might not love them in the same way a parent loves a child, I do care about your child, but I have a more objective view of them and where they're, what we're trying to accomplish here. And so when I suspend your child, this is not about me punishing your child. This is me applying a consequence that I hope will teach a lesson. I tell our principals all the time at principals meetings that we are in the education business. Everything that we do in schools should be wrapped around the idea of educating. Even when we suspend kids, you're not suspending kids and just sending them home because they did something wrong. The suspension is kind of like the tool. The real magic happens in that conversation. In the why are you being suspended? This action led to a suspension. We're hoping that you have an understanding that you want to change that behavior. So it's about education. And again, it's hard for parents. I get it. When you see your child suffering, when you see your child, let's say even in tears because they're being told that there's a consequence at school, you want to protect them. You want to rescue them. You want to overturn that consequence. But I think that there's greater damage in that because again, I think if they trust us that what we're trying to do is educate your child, and this is one tool we have to educate your child. If they believe us, and if we have this trusting relationship, which is important, then we can kind of all work towards that goal. Because we, again, at the end of the day, we are in the education business. That is our core business.
So speaking of that, what do, or I should say, let me put it this way. What are the qualities of a great classroom?
That's a great question. I think, one quality that comes to mind is whenever I walk the halls, and I think sometimes, teachers or even principals are embarrassed when there's a loud classroom happening, and they want to close the door. And again, I always kind of discourage that. I'm like, to me, a loud classroom means that there are people talking, kids, and that means kids. If it's loud, that means the kids are talking, the kids are asking questions, the kids are kind of sharing knowledge with each other. So the starting point is, and again, there's always exceptions. If you're writing a quiz or a test or some kind of assignment, obviously you want some kind of more like, quiet space. But for the most part, just generally speaking, I like a classroom that has a lot of, learning noises, which means, kids are talking, teachers are circulating, teachers are asking more questions than telling answers. I always say some of my best mentors in my, adult life, they've never given me any answers. They've only asked really good questions, and they've made me come to some kind of, resolution or solution on my own. And, again, there's so many cliches about that, about, give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, teach the person to fish, and you feed them for life. And so for me, another aspect of an effective classroom is the teacher's asking a lot of questions. The teacher is circulating, not sitting at a desk, not standing at the front. Even the visual of that. Again, I want to be clear. not all the time. Sometimes they're, and maybe that's also an aspect of an effective classroom, is that there's variety. It doesn't look like the same every day. So when I say it's noisy, when I say it's kind of somewhat chaotic, organized chaos, not every day though. Again, I think, especially with today's children, having a shorter attention span, a teacher has to really make sure that there's a variety of ways that they are, teaching in the classroom, that kids are learning in a classroom. There's got to be times where kids are working together in small groups. There are times where children have to work on their own. So, yeah. And obviously things like having technology, because again, we can stick our head in the sand as an older generation and say, no, we're going to force you to, to kind of, to teach and learn without technology. But that's just ignoring our world. We're doing our kids a disservice. So embrace it, recognize that it's, that it's a part of our world now. And so you need technology in classrooms. And the challenge as a school district leader is making sure, because that there's a cost to that. And so, yeah, I can go and spend millions of dollars this summer to buy all the newest technology. Within about 3 or 4 years, that tech is basically, kind of obsolete. Yeah.
Well, you just gave me a phrase that I love. I'm going to name this podcast. The title is going to be, you just said it, learning noises. I love that, because I mean, that to me is one of the most common aspects of that. The answer to that question is classes, they're not quiet. They're engaged. Students are engaged. But I love that phrase, learning noises. When you hear learning noises, good stuff is happening in the classroom. If I can kind of now flip that, and as you reflect on the qualities of great school leaders, principals, vice principals, what does that look like for you?
I mean, if I take the teacher role and, I expand it, I take it let's say at a higher view of the school, there's a lot of similarities. I tell a lot, we have an aspiring leadership program for teachers who are looking at one day becoming vice principals and principals. And, I often get asked to speak to them. And one of the first things I say to them is, you're leaders already. A classroom teacher is a leader. Yes, the people that you're leading are small. Sometimes they're tiny and they're 4 and 5-year-olds. Sometimes they're 17, 18-year-olds, but you're leaders. And so a lot of those same qualities you can apply to in the principal role. And so what do I look for effective principals? Number one is that, they are not just in their office, that they are circulating in the classrooms, in the hallways. A few years ago, I gave our principals, for me I hope they received it as a compliment, because I was new to Niagara Catholic, I spent the first year just really visiting schools and getting to know our principals and walking the hallways with them. And what I discovered, which again, as a former principal, I never did this. And I wish I did. It was amazing how every single one of them, no matter we were walking the hallways, they knew their students by name. We'd be walking the hallways, and a grade 1 student would walk up and say good morning, and the principal would say good morning, Jessica, and kind of and she'd walk away, and it would be good morning, Jason, and good morning, Peter, and I remember at a principal's meeting saying, that is, I can't tell you how impactful that was for me to see our principals know our students by name. And it's in our some of our literature in Niagara Catholic. Our vision and mission statement is about called by name. I mean, we are living out the gospel when we say that you're called by name. How powerful is it, even as an adult, when someone knows your name? Like you meet someone on the street and they remember your name. That really tells. I think that it instantly gives you an insight that this person cares about me. And again, as a principal, now in my defense, my last school where I was a principal, I had 1,200 kids, K to 8. There was a lot of kids, but again, some of our largest schools, we have schools that are, have 800, 850 kids. I go to those schools, those principals know all those kids' names. And so that's, to me, that's an important part is knowing the people that you lead, knowing your staff, knowing your students. another important aspect is recognizing, again, getting back to, let's stick to our core business, and so there's a lot of managerial tasks in being a principal, creating bus schedules, supervision schedules, managing your budget, all that stuff. And that's important and you have to do it. But don't forget that the core business is learning. And are you leading that learning? And leading doesn't mean that you're the expert in every, subject area. Let's look at a high school. A principal is a former teacher. If she was a former teacher of English, she can't be an expert in the math department. But are you the champion of learning in the building? Are you making sure that stays kind of on the front burner all the time? I remember reading, and forgive me, I forget which book I read this in, but I used this at one of our principals' August meetings with our principals. And in this book, it was a leadership book, and it talked about the difference between urgent and important. And it said, as a leader, you deal every day with things that are urgent and every day with things that are important. And the important stuff won't necessarily have, let's say, a time crunch to it. Like if you don't get to the important stuff today, the organization might not cease to exist or might not fail. Mm-hmm. But if you don't deal with the urgent stuff today, there's a possibility that something really bad might happen at the end of the day if you don't deal with the urgent stuff. Let's use in a simple example. If there's a fire in the building, that's urgent and you can't ignore it. You got to deal with it immediately. Pull the fire alarm, evacuate the students and staff. The fire department comes. That's urgent. Learning, while maybe not urgent, is important. And so if you ignore the important, over time, that will kill the organization. Mm-hmm. And if we look at it even like, our own self, like our own kind of bodies, if you have a very acute pain in say in your chest right now, that's urgent. You better go to the hospital or have someone drive you to the hospital and have a doctor look at it. Mm-hmm. Eating healthy, let's say, it's important, but it's not urgent. If you decide to have a slice of cheesecake today and maybe eat kind of junk food all day today, it's not going to kill you. But if you do that over every day for the next 3 or 4 years, it's probably going to lead to a lot of really serious health issues, maybe even eventually lead to an early death. So the point of that for our principals was learning is the important things that are happening in our schools. And so there are going to be some days where there's a million things going on that are urgent and you might not get to it. And that's okay. I give you permission to say, this day I didn't get to the important things. But you have to make sure that you schedule important things in your calendar, because if you don't, it's so easy to get distracted by the urgent things, because there's always urgent things happening in our schools. And so that was my kind of, talk to them that one summer was, make this year a year where you are scheduling the important stuff of learning. And so getting back to, I talked earlier about data, we've really tried to give them the tools through different analytics, different programs, to use the tools that we're supporting them with to bring that learning, that important part of their job, to the front burner and having those conversations with our teachers. So for me, an important role of a principal now is to be that, not necessarily the lead learner or the expert learner, but the champion of learning in the building. Mm.
So Camillo, if we now kind of turn to the parents, what do you think are the most important aspects of the education system, or most important parts of their kids learning through the system that parents should understand?
I think it's natural that for parents, they often look at schools through their lens of their experience of education. And so we are sometimes at the mercy of how they experience their own education system. And again, this is just our reality that for some parents, school was not a happy place. For some parents, school was not a place where that brings back fond memories. For some, school was a place of stress and anxiety. And so we have to overcome that, obviously. Also, for many of our parents where school was a place of happiness and success, it's a different place today. Even though I talked about how our parents grew up with social media, I think we could all agree that, a parent today of children in elementary school, or especially high school, you're a parent, it sounds like, of children in high school. Your experience in the York Catholic Board in the late 90s or in the mid 90s is different than what your kids are experiencing today. Whether it's technology, whether it's the focus on mental health in our schools and classrooms today. And so I often say, one of our jobs is to not just educate students, but to educate parents on what a classroom looks like. A lot of our parents still want, kind of some old school, no pun intended, ideas of, how schools should run, whether it's, spelling tests and quizzes and tests, and everything is, very kind of like, again, in rows and quiet classrooms. And, there's this tendency sometimes to kind of, knock, let's say, new ways of learning. And so my role, I think, as a director, my role as a district leader is to try and find, we've got to, again, going back to the idea that we need variety. I'm not interested in completely throwing out everything that let's say a classroom looked like in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. But I also recognize that we have to evolve as schools. So our parents, we need to, they have to become, partners in this. I'm a big believer that we need to invite our parents into our schools and classrooms more than less, because the way that you start to eliminate that sense of distrust, because there is distrust nowadays. I think it's a societal problem. It's an epidemic. No one seems to trust, institutions. They don't trust governments, experts. And I think, as educators, as teachers, as principals, as school boards, we now have become part of like that expert group that people distrust. And so how do you mitigate that?
Yeah.
By opening your doors, by being transparent, by inviting parents in.
So how are you doing that? Because, my kids are the last few years of elementary, my nephew's starting high school next year. And by and large, to me, even though I know the system well, I know systems all across the country. I've done school visits for years. My own kid's school feels more like a black box than the work I've done. Right? I mean, I'm sure I could ask for a school visit and that kind of stuff, but I feel that with all the learning technologies out there are ways to open up that classroom that might not just be in the typical way. Are you exploring any of that, or how are you inviting them into the classroom? Because I think that's a real key point, and I wish as a whole system we could do way more of it.
To me, that's been a bit of a crusade for me to have our parents, kind of come into our schools as much as possible, whether it's celebrations or events, or just even like an everyday event. Now, I recognize I have to balance that with the idea that, classrooms are sacred spaces. And so, when parents come into it, it causes disruption and it causes, a bit of chaos, and it does for some. Again, we also have to balance that with, the idea of equity. For some parents, they can't come to the classroom, even if they were invited. Their life might not allow for it. And what's the impact on those kids whose parents can't come in? And so again, there's a lot of kind of moving parts to this. Having said that, I do think, again, the idea of, it's not an all or nothing proposition. How do we find that balance? And so in Niagara Catholic, what we've done is we've started, we have Catholic Education Week every May. It's an expectation that our schools, every classroom has to once during that week invite parents in for one lesson, a math lesson, a gym lesson, a science lesson,
all across the board.
Across the board.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And again, it gets parents into schools. It starts to remove some of those barriers. It starts to remove some of that kind of like, the Wizard of Oz feel of like what's happening there.
Yeah.
And you know what, Jason, I think a real important piece to this is as well is relationships. I know it sounds cliche, but
No, but
I mean,
we're
as
a
a
relational
teacher,
human
get to
beings.
know
Yeah.
your parent, your child's parents.
Yeah.
The primary teachers do a really good job of this because oftentimes they walk their kids out at the end of the day, either to the bus or to
That's
get
right.
picked up, and they're interacting with the parents all the time. They do a fantastic job at it. It's harder as as adolescents. The grade 8 boy doesn't want his mother to come pick him up at school, so the grade 8 teacher is going to have a harder time connecting with each one of his or her students' parents. But again, there's some opportunities throughout the school year, whether it's, whether you're having a movie night in the gymnasium with all parents, whether you're having, let's say, a Christmas concert, whether you're having a school mass, a liturgy at the church. Again, the more often times that even if it's cursory interaction with teachers and principals and vice principals, it starts humanizing the, kind of the school.
The whole dynamic.
What principals find, and what I find, the principals and schools and teachers who open up their classroom doors more often and school doors more often, again, I don't have the math to back this up. This is more anecdotal. Mm-hmm. I find I get, as a director, and my superintendents get less of those kind of complaints about, when a child gets suspended, when a child gets, consequences, detention, those parents are less likely to complain about it because they have a relationship. And there's an understanding that, I know this teacher. This teacher, I've interacted with this teacher now half dozen times. They're a good person.
Yeah.
They're reasonable.
Well, I love that idea. I mean, and I think a little goes a long way in this regard, right? Like one in the spring, one in the fall would be, I think, a great balance. Like, I would love to just sit and, kind of observe and meet the teachers, see them in their element, see how, because I think a lot of times parents also don't understand how complex a classroom is. 30 plus kids in a class, there's a lot of different behaviors. There's a lot of different backgrounds. There's a lot of different needs. There's a lot of different specializations. And, typically when I get people criticizing the system, I say, well, when was the last time you've been in a classroom? When was the last time you've seen what a teacher needs to do? Could you do A, B, C, and D? And then they start to reflect and realize. So I think that would be good for the whole general public to just see the system, because I think they would also see the needs of the system and would hopefully take that to the ballot box when they go vote, because that's how we'll move the system. But I digress. I want to move on to some general questions and maybe about the teaching and learning in the district. And of course, the most pressing topic in conversation, I think rightly so, is AI in education, because I think our typical systems and structures are going to be very upset by AI. So I'm just curious how you and your leadership team, and even beyond that, your colleagues in the district are thinking about AI and what you're doing to kind of, implement a different way of doing teaching and learning.
Yeah, I would say for the last, definitely the last 12 months, last year, maybe even 18 months, the idea of AI's topics have, they have dominated any kind of, of our meetings as directors, senior staff, teacher PD. Full acknowledgement or full disclosure that we're kind of, as a school district, we're early on in our path down the AI kind of mindset. I personally have I wouldn't consider myself kind of like a leading expert. There are some school district directors around the province that I lean on and reach out to. So for me, in anything in my life, whether it's personal or professional, if I don't know a lot about it, I kind of spend a lot of time first kind of learning about it and exploring it. So about a year ago, we created an AI learning committee. We have our CIO on it. We have a couple of our principals and vice principals who have a real interest in this. We have a couple of our teachers that are on it. We have some of our, we have corporate staff on it. Because when I think of AI, the tendency in education is to talk about how it impacts the classroom. But our reality is that we can maybe leverage AI in other ways on the corporate side,
of course,
to help kind of make some of the more menial tasks that we do more efficient and effective. So again, we've been really kind of exploring high level right now what that might look like. And so we're, like I said, we're early stages. What I would say to you is this, just from a 30,000 feet perspective on my own personal thoughts around AI. I understand that the natural tendency first is for people to be scared of AI, that it will have a real disruptive impact in classrooms. And the easy ones, the low hanging fruit is, kids are going to be using ChatGPT to write their essays and to create to complete assignments. And that's true. There's no denying everywhere. That it is happening. I've used AI for myself and kind of maybe putting together some kind of thoughts and ideas for addressing, a group of staff. Rather than trying to, create ways and obstacles and walls to deny our students this, and I think most Ontario school districts are doing this because we've kind of been part of the same kind of learning. We need to find a way, and again, I'm going to speak very, very generally. We need to start embracing it and creating the structures where we are actually, helping kids to use AI to help them in their learning. I envision now. Again, I don't know how many years out, but I do envision a time in education where kids will have very much tailor-made learning, learning for themselves, for their needs, their strengths, and AI will be kind of almost like a tutor to, the teacher in the classroom will be using AI to help, individualize the learning of each child in their classroom based on, like we said, their strengths, their areas of need. That's, again, to me, that's a bit of a utopian and, ideal. I don't know how we get there. I do think that there's going to be a lot of kind of hiccups along the way. The one thing that concerns me about AI is, when I think about, we talked earlier about maps, and for people of our generation that grew up before GPS, if I said to you, Jason, right now, without using GPS, get yourself down to, like, say, Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto, and you probably could figure it out. You probably get in the car, you have a general understanding of where to go, and you'd find yourself there because you grew up not relying on GPS. My daughters, I'm ashamed to say, they don't know the major streets in Burlington where they've lived their entire lives. If I say go west on, go west on Dundas Avenue, they'll be like, "What's Dundas? And
which one's Dundas?"
Yeah, and which way is west? Is it left or right?
Yeah.
So my fear about AI and introducing it in the classroom early on is that we might be, or not might be, I think we will be, turning off a part of a brain that for our students that they have to work on.
Yeah.
I think AI for people in our generation is amazing because I think we've learned the basics and now we can use it to enhance what we already know. Yeah. Another example I give in cars is the backup camera. I remember,
these are great analogies, by the way. These are
I drove my daughter's car that, and her backup camera was broken or something. Yeah. And even me, as a 50-year-old, I had a hard time remembering to kind of turn my back and look behind because I hadn't done it for so long. And so, we can use technology to enhance our work, but there has to be a baseline of what we already have to know in order to use that technology. Yeah. My fear is that some of, we can't just jump into AI, full force early on because our kids need to kind of learn the basics. And in some ways, and again, now I'm going to sound like a bit of an old school guy. I think we have an example of this with, let's say, using even like technology, in the 90s and early 2000s, like, the idea of calculators. If you remember, there was a debate, I want to say 20 years ago in my early teaching years about, do we let kids use calculators in classrooms? And I think that we landed on, you know what, let them use it. It was the idea of like, almost like, hey, it's like glasses. If a kid needs glasses, let them use the glasses. And I don't know if that's fully, again, this is my own personal opinion, because I don't know if some of my colleagues agree with me. I'm afraid that what we've done is we've created a generation of kids who have a hard time with mental math, just doing like basic arithmetic in their head. Like you see them at a, if you're trying to make change at a Tim Hortons, if you're paying cash still, nowadays no one pays cash. And so that's my fear about AI, is we have to make sure that whatever we decide as educators, that we have to make sure that the AI is only introduced at a time after kids have mastered the basic skills. We can't go feet first into saying, okay, use AI to generate this kind of project. Kids have to understand what does the project look like when you do it on your own.
Well, I think the best way to kind of wrap our minds around this is writing, right? Like reading, and then particularly writing is the greatest learning software we've ever, if I can use that metaphor of hardware software, the greatest software that the human brain has ever come across for thinking and for deep thinking. And if we go straight to AI writing, there's a tremendous loss there. So I think we have to figure out how we, incorporate those old practices, and then at the right time introduce how AI can enhance that. But the reading and writing has to be done without aids for a significant amount of time, and that upends the whole progress, right? Like I didn't write. Like, I mean, I wrote a lot of in-class stuff, but by the end of my graduate degree, for sure, everything was done on the computer, right?
Correct.
We didn't write in-class exams. And I think some of those old practices have to come back to save that process.
We said, when we talk about teaching to read, we say in the early years, you teach a child to read. It's learning to read, and then once they master reading, they read to learn. So you learn to read, and then you end up reading to learn. And I think we can take that same kind of analogy and metaphor to AI and remind ourselves that education maybe, even before our time like 2 generations ago, it was about learning facts and learning figures, like going back to geography, learning the maps and learning, the countries in Africa and where the borders were. That no longer is necessary. Education now is teaching kids how to learn, because learning is changing all the time. And if you're only stuck on teaching kids ideas and facts, those facts and ideas become very, obsolete very quickly. And so our job is really to teach kids how to learn. And that way they can apply it, whether it's AI, whether it's, in any kind of field, they're applying what they've learned how to learn in that field.
So with that, Camillo, if I can ask you to look forward, say 50 years into the future, what do you see education looking like?
I hope, again, speaking of AI, I hope that there's still a very human component to education. There has to be. Getting back to the idea of the greatest teacher is about creating relationships. The greatest teacher and principal is about connections with the human connection, getting to know them by name. And I think that we will never, despite some of the kind of dark predictions, schools will always need strong teachers to create those relationships with kids. I do think in 50 years, though, I think AI will be a big part of a tool that teachers can use and kids can use in their own kind of tailor-made learning cycle. I do think, if you think about how AI is being utilized now in the healthcare industry, where, it's taking all this information about a person's, symptoms and generating some, very, high probability ideas of what they're experiencing. We can take that in the education world and help kids have a, kind of a more tailor-made education experience. And so I do think in 50 years, I think there will be a lot more, kind of like both human and technology, if you want to call it AI, if that's what we're still using in 50 years, if they're using that type terminology.
My penultimate question is always, if you had a magic wand and you could do anything to the system, you're all powerful, what would you do?
Wow. If I could create greater trust amongst all the stakeholders, I think right now in this world that we live in, there's this real deep distrust. Whether it's management doesn't trust the unions don't trust the management, parents don't have a distrust of the schools, at school districts, politicians, and I think, and it might be naive of me, but I do think that we are creating a generation of children that there's this kind of sense of like distrust. And so for me, we have to move back to a place in time where there was a trust for education in general. Again, and this is not placing blame. Like I said, I would say that I'm as much to blame in that as senior management as our frontline staff. I think we need to start building a culture of an area where we can just all trust each other, where parents can trust that schools are trying to do their very best to support their children, that they're not questioning every decision that we're making. And equally, we have to trust parents that they're doing their very best to try and support schools. So if I had a magic wand, is to try and kind of maybe just kind of remove that real sense of distrust in our society. And again, ideally for all society, but I'm just talking about education now, because I do think, our kids pick up on that. Our kids pick up, and I've had these conversations with parents over the years. Even though you think that you're kind of keeping it separate from, little Johnny in grade 3, he's hearing you when you speak badly of the teacher, or speak badly of the principal, or speak badly of the school. And the last thing we want is to let the children think that the most important adults in their lives, their teachers, their principals, and their parents aren't supportive of each other.
And with that, the last question is always, what book, album, movie, podcast would you recommend to the audience?
I'm reading 2 books right now. I love biographies, and I've read so many biographies. I just love reading people's life stories. I talk about how, I love movies. So first of all, I just watched the movie F1, which was fantastic. I loved it with Brad Pitt. But it's funny, in my generation, if you remember, successful movies would always come out with a part 2, part 3. And I would say in the last 20 years, movie producers, they're so smart at this. They realize that people actually they don't want the part 2 or part 3. They want to go back and hear the origin story. So that's why for me, biography is like an origin story. I know where you are today. What got you to this place today? And so one that I'm reading right now, it's kind of old school. It's actually JFK.
Oh, nice.
I've always been interested. Anytime I see a documentary, I'm always interested. Again, first Catholic president of the United States, obviously, tragic ending to his life. So I'm reading one right now. I got it maybe about 2 weeks ago, and I'm about halfway through. Just fascinating. It's also, for me, I also love to read books of different time periods. And so reading about the world, North America, the US mostly, in the 50s and 60s, and what a different world it was then, even obviously from today, but even from the 50s to the 80s. And you realize one thing, what I'm realizing too, is that as much as I've said so many times today, oh, it's so different, when I grew up in the 80s and 90s was very, very different than the 50s and 60s. So this is a constant cycle. We can pretend that, oh, this is different. Today's world is so much different than it was 20 years ago, and it's never been this different than in the past. That's not true. We have to recognize that is the nature of the human condition. We evolve, we get better, we get smarter, and it changes. And not everything gets better. Some things, you can argue that that's one book I'm reading. Another book I'm reading, and again, it gets back to one of my earlier comments that I made, was the importance of failure in learning is it's called Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed. And it's kind of an oldie, but I'm going back to it. I read it about 15 years ago or 10 years ago, and I'm reading it again. And it's the idea of the airline industry. When it first came out, it realized that, there was different airlines at the time, like United and Delta and all that. And they realized their mistakes were catastrophic. If I make a mistake in my job today, normally no one's going to die. But if you make a mistake in the airline industry, people die. And so they realized very quickly that they had to share what they learned from their mistakes in order to develop, ironically, trust in the airline industry as a whole, because they would all benefit from that trust. And so the idea of the black box, as we all know, if you watch it, if you watch news and there's a tragedy with an airline, you know what the black box is. They have two of them now. They've got the voice recorder and they have the black box where it shares all the data from the instrumental data. And they did that in order to find out after a crash, what was the mistake? Was it a human error? Was it a mechanical error? Was it conditions? Was it a combination? And then let's share it with each other. So that way we can avoid a similar or exact same mistake. And again, it's a leadership book. So it talks about how you can find same lessons in leadership about kind of learning from mistakes. And to me, it's one of my mantras with our leaders is that don't be afraid to make mistakes. In fact, when you make mistakes, that tells me that you are pushing the boundaries. You're willing to learn. You're willing to evolve and willing to get better.
I think that's a great note to end on. Camillo, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jason.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.